Hello. Today I'm going to continue the discussion I started yesterday on malnutrition. Talked about scurvy specifically in yesterday's video, and thinking overnight, I'm actually a little glad that I had to split it up now, because to be fair to the doctors, because I'm going to razz on the doctors a bit today, as I did last time. But to be fair, vitamins weren't discovered until the early 20th century. So saying, why didn't they just give them vitamin B? Why didn't they just give them more of this vitamin? Is a little unfair, because they knew certain foods helped. They didn't know, specifically why certain foods helped, or why some foods were better than others. And so that's where we get a lot of old folk remedies, take this if you have this symptom or whatever. And it's, the people making these suggestions didn't know that, the plant they were suggesting you take for whatever ailment was high in a certain vitamin or a certain mineral. They just knew that taking this plant seems to help. And so, like I said, I am going to razz a little bit on the doctors, just because they could have done a little better, but at the same time, I do recognize they didn't necessarily know about vitamins. Well, they didn't know about vitamins specifically, so for them to diagnose it as we would diagnose it today, it was a lot different. Now, scurvy specifically, like I said, it became pretty obvious fruits and vegetables helped cure it. And it should have made sense that fruits and vegetables could help prevent it, but for some reason that never went over. So, yeah, I'm not going to let these scurvy doctors off too easily, but, for overall reference, yes, they didn't know about vitamins at the time, so... Or, shouldn't be overly harsh on them. So the first thing, vitamin K, we're going to skip ahead to vitamin K. Vitamin K helps the blood clot. And so if you don't get enough vitamin K, your blood won't clot, you can get bleeding. So children will sometimes get hemorrhagic diseases, which is basically bleeding diseases. Interesting thing here is, depending on where you are in the world, it's going to vary with your nutrition input, but the statistic I saw was 1 in 60 to 1 in 250 children, or babies, suffer from hemorrhagic diseases due to a lack of vitamin K. That's quite a bit. Like I said, your less developed countries, it's going to be around the 1 in 60. Your more developed countries, it's going to be around your 1 in 250. So why haven't we heard of this big outbreak of hemorrhagic diseases among children? Especially like newborns are being, they're bleeding, and the bleeding, it can be external or internal. So, why isn't this? And one of the reasons is, like I said, this is a nutrition problem, and it's almost a self-correcting nutrition problem. So, baby's born, it either breastfeeds or it's raised on formula. It gets the nutritions it needs. Then they start to transition to solid foods, and the parent buys. Usually most parents will buy one thing. It's like, I'll stock up on strained carrots, and then after a while they'll start to vary from there. And so, depending on what the parent buys, the child might not get enough vitamin K. However, like I said, this is almost self-correcting, because they initially buy one thing. But as time goes on, the parent starts to vary the child's diet. So by the time, malnutrition most diseases of malnutrition take about a month before you start to show symptoms. I would assume with a newborn baby, it's a lot sooner than that, just because they're still developing and they burn through vitamins faster. But by the time the child starts showing symptoms, the parent has started to vary their diet more. So, like I said, we get these diseases, but they start to self-correct. So it doesn't hit the media as fast, and we don't hear about this big hemorrhagic diseases among newborns as we would, other diseases, just because it's almost a self-correcting thing. Not always a self-correcting thing. It can be, there will be times when the child will have to be hospitalized, whatever. So, new parents, just remember when you start to transition your child to solid foods, give them some variety to begin with. And especially look for things with vitamin K. Vitamin A. So vitamin A is fairly common. It can be found in a lot of things. But again, depending on where you are in the world, your availability isn't always the same. And so again, this is something that generally affects children more than adults, although it can affect adults, but night blindness is a common problem with a deficiency of vitamin A. And it can lead to complete blindness if it continues. But and again, this is something, like I said, we see it in children. Well, it can happen to anyone, but when it happens to children, it's going to be like a lifetime thing. So it's more, it's pointed out more as a childhood thing, just because it's going to affect the child for their entire life, whereas the adult, it's only going to partially affect their lives. Speaking of childhood diseases, rickets. Rickets is a lack of vitamin D. Again, this can affect anyone, but it's more obvious in children because children are still developing. So, rickets, vitamin D helps us to absorb calcium. So you can get rickets from a lack of calcium, but you're more likely to get it from a lack of vitamin D, just because everyone, we're aware of the calcium problems. We give children milk, etc., all this stuff to give them calcium, but we don't realize that the vitamin D is necessary for them to absorb the calcium. And so, and it's, like I said, it's more obvious in children. They're still developing, so their bones are going to be more misshapen or more stunted or whatever. Again, as an adult, I can stop taking vitamin D, I'll get rickets, and it'll weaken my bones, but I'm not going to be like misshapen or anything, just because, or I'm less likely to become misshapen because my bones are developed about as far as they're going to go. So again, rickets is generally looked at as a child disease. It's believed to come from the German word ricken, which means twisted, which makes some sense. Daniel Whistler in 1645 and Francis Gleason in 1650 tried to treat it. Gleason, not sure how to pronounce it, had actually had a clinic for rickets, and so he's the more famous of the two, even though he came later. So they both described the symptoms of it. And so Gleason tried cauterization, which I'm not sure what he was cauterizing. He tried splinting, basically let's try bending the bone back into shape and then putting a splint around it and hope that it self-corrects and heals itself. And he tried suspension, hang someone up and hope that gravity will stretch their bones back into shape. I mean, these might have reshaped the bones some, but they didn't get to the actual problem. Again, this was the 1600s, so this is the sort of thing you would more likely do to an adult than to a child, so it sort of shows that, yes, rickets has been an adult disease in the past, too. It's just, like that. It's more obvious in children, but it can be an adult disease. During the Industrial Revolution, bread became the main staple, and so people were eating a lot of bread and not getting stuff that had vitamin D in it, and so people started getting rickets. It was around the 1920s where someone suddenly decided maybe rickets is dietary. Again, early 20th century, people were discovering, vitamins. Not quite sure if they made the connection between vitamin D and rickets at this time, but it was suggested to be dietary. So cod liver oil, you don't hear about that as much. I know, growing up, especially like, you see it more in old cartoons than anything these days, but references to people giving their children cod liver oil. And that was just a way to get them vitamin D. B1, also known as thiamine. So beriberi was a disease, Asia, Polynesia, Indonesia. It was common there, parts of India, but primarily, that part of the world, not wasn't a Western thing so much. And this is a lack of the B1 vitamin, or thiamine. You can apparently get it through alcoholism. I don't know if that is somehow the alcohol deletes your B1, or if the just alcoholics just don't have a great diet. Either one could work for an explanation of that. It is described almost throughout Asia in ancient times, or ancient writings. Again, as with scurvy, they didn't call it beriberi necessarily, but they describe the symptomology of it and the causes to some extent. So one thing, Japan had a name for it. They called it kake disease, which was basically translates leg disease, because beriberi doesn't affect the legs, but makes it hard to walk. Basically, it affects the nervous system primarily. It can affect the cardiovascular system, but that's not as common. And so, basically, it can cause paralysis, it can cause weakness, it can cause trembling. And so, apparently they called it leg disease, I guess, because you couldn't walk as easily, maybe. I don't know. Couldn't find a good explanation of why they called it leg disease. Weird thing about this is, so normally your malnutrition diseases affect the poor people because they don't have as much food. In Japan, it was the opposite, because basically rice diets, white rice is low in vitamin B1, and so the upper class were eating more white rice. The lower class had to mix barley with their rice, so the lower classes were actually getting the vitamins they needed. The upper class weren't, because again, it was a status thing to eat white rice. Now, Europeans, Jacobus Bontius in the 1629 is probably the earliest European to describe it, or to and He was traveling in Java. One thing I found, so the name beriberi, that's actually from the Sinhalese language. It literally, you look it up, you look up a translation, they'll say it means weakness, which it does, I guess. But that's the literal translation. Beriberi is I can't, and that's basically I got this disease, now I'm weak, I can't do stuff as well as I used to be able to. And so that's how beriberi got named. In 1887, there was a outbreak in the Dutch East Indies. This was, of course, the microscope had been invented about 100 years before this, so we knew about bacteria, so they thought it was bacteriological. So there was a big campaign to let's scrub things down and kill the bacteria, which didn't work. So they sent over a group of people. This was the Dutch, of course. They were the ones colonizing the area then. They sent over a group of doctors to study the problem. Christian Eichmann, or I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, he was sort of the lead there. He noticed that when chickens fed on white rice, they got similar symptoms. So he made a connection between the white rice and the chickens, white rice and beriberi. The problem is, again, they didn't know about vitamin D at the time, so they weren't thinking it's a lack of vitamin D causing this. And so now people started thinking rice is causing it. Because rice was not a large staple in European diet, it was a large staple in the Asian and Indonesian diet. So obviously the rice is the problem. And not that, excessive rice was the problem, or rice to the exclusion of other things was the problem, but rice itself was not the problem. But they thought it was, because again, they didn't understand about vitamins, they didn't know about nutrition as we do today. There was a man, Adolf Vorderman. He went over to study the problem in Java. He studied about 100 prisons where rice was the common diet given. And he discovered that by feeding the prisoners red rice instead of white rice, then they started to get cured. Still didn't make the connection that it was a diet, that it was a malnutrition thing. Now they thought, okay, it's white rice instead of, specifically as opposed to any rice. But they discovered that red rice would start to cure the beriberi in these prisoners, and that's about as far as I could find in specific details of the disease or the curing of it. Obviously, over time, we learned about vitamins, and we came to realize that it was a vitamin B1 deficiency that caused it, and not rice oven by itself. But again, we went for maybe 50 to 100 years believing that rice was the problem, when it wasn't the rice itself, it was just too much rice excluding other things. Okay, B2. B2 is riboflavin. It's found in almost everything, so it's very rare to see diseases with a lack of riboflavin, just because it's so abundant in everything. And that's sort of the only reason I bring this up, is because it's like scurvy almost. They had trouble telling about it because vitamin C is very prevalent. Sure, you can have a diet low in vitamin C. It's harder to have a diet low in B2 because riboflavin's in more things than vitamin C is, and also all the things that cause scurvy, the high grain diets, the high meat diet, riboflavin's in this stuff. So your go-to things for when your fruit and vegetables aren't being produced still had riboflavin in it, and so there aren't. It is possible to have a riboflavin deficiency, but there are no riboflavin deficient diseases out there, just because it's so rare for this to happen. B3 niacin. So corn is lacking, doesn't have a lot of B3 in it. Now, not a problem. Corn's not a big European thing, or it wasn't until we went to the New World. Native Americans showed us how to grow corn. Still wasn't a problem. We still weren't getting pellagra, which is the big disease that comes from a lack of niacin. So what was happening? The Native Americans would boil their corn in a lime solution, and that would infuse it with niacin. So whether or not they started doing this because way back in the past they were getting pellagra or not, I don't know. It just seems a weird thing. Why would you add lime to your cooking water? And so it's possible that they were getting pellagra way back before they were keeping records of things, and this just became a tradition. The settlers, we learned how to grow corn. We weren't boiling in lime, but we brought over a bunch of other stuff. So beans are high in the B vitamins. So we were eating corn, but we were also eating beans and other stuff, so we weren't having a vitamin B niacin deficiency. Then we started exporting corn around the world. South America, Europe, this is great stuff. It's cheap, it's easy to grow. You can do a lot with it. It doesn't cause any diseases that we know about, because so far all the Europeans who have eaten it haven't gotten coming down with diseases. So then it started to. 1735, a man named Don Caspar Cassel, he described something called mal de la rosa, which basically he thought it was a form of leprosy. He was Italian, that's why he named it in Italian. Basically, the first symptoms sort of affected the skin. Dermatitis is one of these symptoms. Basically, there are either 3Ds or 4Ds, depending on what website you look at. Dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia, and then the fourth one is death, which some people leave that one off the list just because it's sort of obvious diseases can kill you, or potentially kill you. 1778, Gaetano Strambio shows that he discovers that this is more than just a skin disease, and he links the diarrhea and the dementia to the dermatitis. So there's more to it than that. He believes it comes from eating old bread and bad polenta, and polenta is basically ground up corn boiled. So he's on the right track to the point of the cause that we're eating. But again, it's not the polenta itself. It is the polenta in excess and to the exclusion of other things. So again, we're starting down this road that we were on where corn causes pellagra. And no, corn doesn't cause pellagra. Corn to the exclusion of everything else can cause pellagra. But again, we didn't know about vitamins at the time, so we started off on the wrong path again. In 1869, Cesare Lombroso, he believes that's a toxin within the corn. So we're narrowing it down now to the corn again. 1906, there was an outbreak in Alabama, and it started to spread throughout the South, and it continued for several years. And again, it came down to the point the economy, the Southerners began to eat more corn to the exclusion of other stuff. 1914, this is still going on, and a man named Joseph Goldberger suggests this is a malnutrition thing. It's not just a eating the corn thing. It was still another 4 years, 1918, before anyone believed him. And so we had, people were eating corn because it was cheaper. We told them to stop eating corn. They had to spend more money now. And they could have continued to eat corn if they just added a little something, and they wouldn't have had to spend as much more extra money. So a lot of people, were almost driven to poverty because they were told to switch their diet completely as opposed to just supplement their current diet. Those are the big ones that I found for deficiencies. Now there's a story. There is a ship, a German ship, the Kronprinz Wilhelm, or Crown Prince Wilhelm if you want. It was basically not really a cruise ship as we see cruise ships, but it was sort of a luxury ship. But when World War I came, it was refitted to be a battleship. So they added a few guns to it. Still, it was not originally designed to be a battleship, so it didn't have the heavy armor that you would expect of a battleship. And so it wasn't really put out into the big active naval war zone. Instead, they sent it to patrol the South Atlantic, so it's spent a lot of time off the coast of South America. And its primary job was to stop ships, check to see if they have any supplies the Allies might be sending over to Europe, or anything America might be sending to help the Allies, because America wasn't in the war at the time yet. Confiscate these. They also started to take prisoners if they thought, oh, this person might be going over there to join the British Navy. So they started taking prisoners. Basically, a lot of what they were doing would have been considered piracy 100 years earlier, and even today, some people would consider it piracy. And one thing they did, since they were acting as pirates, they started resupplying themselves. Like I said, they were stationed off the coast of South America, so they were far away from the German supply lines. So they would resupply themselves by taking food from the ships that they raided. And because they had the freedom to take whatever they want, they started taking the white flour and high refined sugar and all the extra fancy rich stuff that they wouldn't have gotten normally. And over time, they started to show these signs of malnutrition, didn't know what was causing it. Eventually, they had to surrender. They went up to North America, they surrendered to the Americans. And we kept them quarantined because we had this strange disease. No one knew what was going on. Fortunately, one doctor who had past experience with malnutrition recognized what was going on, gave them vegetable broth, and basically cured them. And so, again, that's, even up until the 1970s, we were still having problems with malnutrition. We still have problems with malnutrition today, but we now know the actual cause. It's more of an ignorance on the individual, or a war's going on, and so we don't have, the foods we would normally have. So we've gotten over the worst of it, I guess, but it still happens. I will also point out, like I said, malnutrition, it takes about a month before people start showing signs of it. So that's another reason it can be misdiagnosed, is simply because we want to look for what changed within the last week or two, and that's why we're looking for what were you exposed to recently, as opposed to what did you stop eating a month ago. That's, like I said, another reason why sometimes it can be misdiagnosed, and affects different people differently. So I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. I know people who live on fast food diets. So they have vitamin C in their system. I have more than them just because I eat more fruits and vegetables. So if we were to go back in time and join the British Navy a few hundred years ago, and get on the high scurvy diet, I've got more vitamin C in my system to start with, so I'm going to start to show symptoms of scurvy later than them because it's going to affect me later. So from the doctor's point of view, the other guy got scurvy, and then it was about a week later that I got it. So maybe I caught it from him as opposed to getting it separate. So, like I said, because everyone has different nutritions when they start into the malnutrition phase of whatever's happening, the malnutrition will start to affect people at different rates. And so it can look like a disease starting to spread as opposed to everyone having a lack of something. So, like I said, that's, razzing on the doctors a little because, yes, they are wrong to blame corn or rice for the problem, but at the same time, the way malnutrition diseases develop, it can be hard to diagnose as a malnutrition disease. Now that we're familiar with the symptoms of most of these diseases, it's easier, but it does make a little sense that in the past they had some problem diagnosing these things. So again, stay healthy, and see you later.